All right, here we are, a quick one, because we are ending book one. So I at least want to get through book one, and then next time we'll go a little faster. And plus, I'm going to either Tuesday or Wednesday expand on the subject of hairs in Redwall and just have a fun discussion about hairs in general and the questions surrounding this whole issue. Especially so, if you're a Redwall fan, you've read most of the books, you'll be able to have that conversation. If you don't want to get spoiled on things and possible spoilers, I would suggest not watching that. But if you like Redwall and want to get more into the nitty gritty, we'll go and talk about that. But a quick one. So we're at chapter 18 all the way to the end of book one and the beginning of book two. So again, not much going on. Um, in terms of because this is only three chapters, but so we have but this is kind of the first big event. So finally we have Clooney attacking Redwall Abbey. One of the interesting, funny things I found reading this was comment about rats being terrible bowmen, which um, I think is actually fairly consistent with the series overall. I think most rats in general, out of all the vermin and villains, tend to not be bowmen. There's some, but it's not as much, and they're not quite as good as some of the other villains at that. So I think that's actually fairly consistent overall. Maybe not entirely, but much more than some other things, which we'll get into with hairs. But I did like that comment. It was kind of funny. It's like, how does the author know this? It's kind of another one of those like the author omniscience questions that's always kind of fun to ask about books like this. So it's like, how does he know that rats are particularly bad bowmen? So it's really funny. Um, we have basically a pretty much failed attempt to really get anywhere. Um, there's even like a giant Boulder involved in all this, which Winifred the Otter and Formal the Mole Eater, just launch over and completely decimates them. But but then there is they uh build this device. I forgot what it was called, but basically a swing thing that flies up in the air, comes down, and kind of can hit a target really bad. The rats developed this, and that was kind of interesting. That was pretty cool. I did not remember that. There's kind of like only a few times where you really get something completely different and new that you really don't think about in terms of medieval warfare. And I don't know if that's rooted in anything. So if anybody knows what that device the rats built in, I believe it's chapter 19 or 20, for flying up in the air and bringing down metal on someone's head, which sounds really bad. Um, if anybody knows what remembers what that was, or and if that has any real reality in medieval warfare, I would love to know more because that was really interesting. I did not remember that. The other important thing we have is in terms of Clooney's side, we also have Cheesthief's um, treachery of Scrag, Scrag, or I almost want to go back. Let me go back and double check the book. Actually, sorry I had to do that, and I'll double check also the other thing in the meantime. Where was that? Where's chapter? Oh, it can't be that. I'm going way too far. Uh, Scrag. Yeah, it was Scrag. I think I said it right. I can't remember if I did. Scrag. So yes, Scrag. So Scrag warms up to Clooney because he's clearly got a brain on his shoulders, unlike a lot of the rats do. He's a weasel, which kind of probably plays into it. Like Brian Jakes is probably playing on something by having Scrag be a weasel and be kind of smarter than your average rat, the average rats are. So we're clearly building up to a thing where Cheesthief, um, Clooney's second or third in command, is basically like, we got to deal with this up and comer, no good. So you can see a treachery is coming, uh, which will be a common thing in Redwall is the treachery angle. Brian Jakes likes to do a lot of this, and we'll see it more and more predominantly in later books, where basically villains just turn on each other because they're greedy and selfish, and kind of the idea is that evil just gets more evil, so they can't really be united because they're all after things for themselves. So that's one of the few kind of, I would say, themes of Brian Jakes, and kind of the thing that kind of just touches kind of how he views evil, is kind of like evil just doesn't have a uniting thing. It basically crumbles in and on itself. Um, People are too selfish, in a sense, and by people, of course, animals in this book, but you get what I mean. So, um, but yeah, so we have the obvious uh, um upcoming treachery of Cheesthief against Scrag, which is being highlighted. Um, it's interesting that Clooney actually does have appreciation for Scrag. It's like the first time we've actually seen like Clooney actually really care what anybody other than himself thinks about situations. So it's um really important there. We have Matthais and Basil. I think this is a really interesting bit because and we'll discuss this when we get to hairs, how a stark contrast this is kind of some of the selfishness we see in some hairs later, and that's part of character development with some hairs. But one of the interesting things is how Brian Jakes plays something that might come off as kind of selfish and inane that some hairs kind of have, where they're always gluttonous and not really thinking about themselves. Some of the, especially immature hairs. But I like how Basil at least appears to be kind of selfish at first, but then he thinks about like, I'm getting my house ready so I can get these voles put away safely, and I'm gonna take care of them. Well, Matthias gets back to Redwall, and there's not room for you. So Basil has actually kind of thought it through, which I found really fascinating. That Basil would actually think this thing through. Um, and Matthias kind of realizes it and apologizes because at first he's kind of irate by all this. And so that's actually kind of interesting, and really kind of shows that Basil actually is still um, a mature, thoughtful, very smart individual when it comes to things. And Matthias is still kind of learning that things aren't quite as maybe the way he would do things, and he's a bit more, kind of go get 'em kind of attitude. Well, Basil is actually somewhat more thoughtful about things, and he actually but I also like kind of their banter, even as they're having this discussion and them still beating up the rats too, right? So it's kind of nice to have that too, where it's clear that even though they're having this disagreement too, and Matthias may be a little bit headstrong, that they're not really like horribly mad and they're still doing it while working together to fight off the rats. I really like that. That's a really great bit, a really great scene from the books. I think that's one of the best scenes so far is the kind of Basil Matthias back and forth, uh, where we kind of get like insights into both of them. while still having a fun action scene. So I think Brian Jacques actually handles that scene really well. The other important thing, and this is the most important thing we're doing, is the introduction of Asmodeus into the series, um, and especially, and of course, this book. Um, Asmodeus is really, I think, probably one of the greatest things that Brian Jacques ever introduced into the series, and it's one of the few things that he never really topped in the series. I don't think this is the best, one of the best things he ever produced, and I like it just because there's nothing particularly. We're gonna get some evil snakes later, but they feel a bit more character. Um, and I don't like they have a bit more character and they feel a bit more like they're actually part of the Redwall world in a sense. But I like Asmodeus is just kind of like this thing that exists, and he's really kind of just like there's nothing other than the intimidation of his thing, of who he is as being this terrifying snake. There's nothing really beyond that. And I like how it really all comes down to, and he does talk a bit more as we'll see in the series, but he doesn't really talk much more than than that one word. There's a little bit of that we'll see later, but he's not a very talkative character. All we have is that repetition of supposedly um, as his name, or and that's one of the I guess fascinating things about Asmodeus is that he's saying a name which is actually rooted in mythological names of Satan or a devilish being. So Brian Jakes is obviously being very deliberate there. But I think what's so interesting about that is that just like sometimes also evil there's kind of the evil that we see in Clooney and in the rats and stuff where they're just selfish, the typical kind of self gain, all that sort of stuff, um, murder, full of want and murder and greed and lust and all that. But there's kind of an evil that also just exists because of the nature of the way the world is. And so there's something deeper that that doesn't even really think about what it's doing. Now, of course, he's a snake, so of course he's feeding, right? So there's somewhat of just, well, he's a snake, he needs to feed on rats. But I really like Asmodeus because it's this line between is it nature or is there something deeper? It's is Asmodeus purely nature being personified here, or is there something really deeper going on with Asmodeus, where he's just where it's what evil looks like when you don't really have to think about it, when you just this is the way it is. Um, I've been this way forever, and that's a much rarer type of evil. And so, yeah, I think Asmodeus is fascinating because it's just that repetition of even the name. Like, there's not there. It kind of goes to almost that Tolkien idea of names mean everything. Um, in a sense, the name of something tells you everything about it, and especially the way Asmodeus says his name with that long S, which I love. Um, it's almost like this is me. I am this. I am everything you ever fear and despise and fear, despise, hate, loathe, and not even hate in a like visceral way of like just the average kind of hate, but almost like the innate thing of something icky, of something that should not even um, exist. Like this, the unnaturalness, and that's what's I think really great about Asmodeus is the naturalness and the unnaturalness of Asmodeus, and it never really gets captured really again in in my view in the series. There's a bit of that with a few other things. We'll see it a bit in Mariel with something that gets brought up, where the creature gets brought up there, um, and there and maybe a bit in Manameo, though that's lesser because again it's a more of a real normal creature. Though we'll talk about that too. But Asmodeus is kind of the pinnacle of this in the series and never gets fully recaptured again. And so what I like about this Brian Jakes' book series is that there's again the question of magic in this series has always been kind of interesting. And is there an unnaturalness and naturalness to the Redwall series, where it kind of feels like, well, it's just knights and with fur, right? But at times, Brian Jakes is willing to go a little deeper, and this is, I think, the clearest and best example of this in the series. And yeah, and we'll get into it more, but I think, um, like we're gonna see that it's kind of like it's more than just a big snake in a sense. There's some, especially when we're dealing with the hypnotic eyes. Now, of course, hypnotic eyes have been kind of a staple among fictional snakes, especially. But I think Brian Jakes captures it the best here. We've seen it done really comically, of course, with Ka and Sir Hiss and Disney, but this is kind of the other way of expressing it that goes back to something much more primal, um, more than just like a silly tactic or something. There's something about the spell nature of Asmodeus' eyes as we get into it that I think is really fascinating, and it kind of doesn't um because it seems like with Ragier the hypnotism is not like, oh, it's fear. The real hypnotism of Asmodeus is fear. Um, in a sense, maybe that's what Asmodeus represents more than anything is fear incarnate. What does fear truly look like? Especially fear based in pure evil. What does because there's a good kind of fear, of course, but when fear merely is rooted in the unnatural evil of something, this unnatural fear, this fear of something that's deeper and beyond our kind of just innate normal senses. Um, so yeah, there we are. Um, and again, so I went a bit longer, especially with Amadeus than I thought, but I think I'll still do a thing on hairs just because it's a fascinating subject, and I think it's kind of one of the most biggest kind of things in Redwall that we're gonna debate is hairs and kind of like The scale of hairs has often been kind of indicates sometimes the scale of the books and other things. So I think I'm going to talk about that sometime next week in the middle of the week instead of at the end. So that'll be something to look forward to. Again, you can follow me on this channel at Badgers and Bells. Um, you can also go to my other channel, Crazy Creature Caricatures, and also get my, and there I have more of my animal stuff, and there's links to some of my work with all my animal stuff. And I'll be providing more. I'm trying to update my website. I started one, and it kind of is just pretty bland. So I'm gonna have that get updated as well as a store through Zazzle. So if you're interested in any of that, you can ask questions over on that channel, and I'll provide links at least to some of that stuff. Um, Other than that, thanks for listening, and have a wonderful day.